September 15th, 1944. Somewhere in the dense forests of eastern France. The morning mist clung to the pine branches like ghostly fingers as Private First Class Jebediah, Jeb Hawkins, crouched beside his makeshift distillery, watching copper tubing drip precious liquid into mason jars. At 23 years old, the son of Tennessee mountain folk had been the laughingstock of the 101st Airborne Division since his arrival in Normandy. His fellow paratroopers believed they were dealing with nothing more than backwoods ignorance, a simple farm boy who talked funny and spent his free time tinkering with what they assumed was illegal alcohol production. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of one of the most devastating weapons the German armored divisions would ever face. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What happened next would transform this ridiculed mountain boy into a legend, whose unconventional methods would prove that sometimes the most brilliant solutions come from the most unexpected places, forever changing how the American forces approached armored warfare. The early morning air carried the scent of pine needles and something else entirely, the sharp, chemical tang that emanated from Jeb's carefully constructed apparatus. Hidden beneath camouflage netting and positioned precisely 50 yards from the company's forward observation post, his operation had been running for 3 weeks without official detection. Captain Marcus Sullivan from Boston had walked past it dozens of times, assuming the young private was simply maintaining equipment or perhaps engaged in some harmless hobby to pass the long hours between patrols. Jeb methodically adjusted the flame beneath his copper pot, his calloused hands moving with the precision of someone who had been perfecting this craft since childhood. Back home in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee, his grandfather had taught him the ancient art of distillation when he was barely 10 years old. But what his army colleagues failed to understand was that Jebediah Hawkins had not simply learned to make moonshine. He had earned a degree in chemical engineering from the University of Tennessee before the conflict began, using his mountain heritage as both camouflage and inspiration for something far more sophisticated than illegal liquor. The liquid now filling his mason jars was not moonshine at all, though it shared many of the same production techniques. Working entirely from memory and using materials scavenged from abandoned German positions, Jeb had successfully synthesized a highly concentrated napalm compound that burned at temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Unlike the standard military-issue incendiary weapons, his formula included several mountain-derived additives that made it stick to metal surfaces with unprecedented tenacity, while producing flames that could not be extinguished with conventional firefighting methods. Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez from New Mexico approached through the undergrowth, his expression displaying the familiar mixture of amusement and mild concern that most of the company showed when dealing with their resident Hillbilly. Rodriguez had served in the Pacific Theater before his transfer to Europe, and had seen enough unconventional warfare to maintain a slightly more open mind than his colleagues. "Hawkins, what in the Sam Hill are you cooking up out here now?" Rodriguez asked, though his tone carried more curiosity than condemnation. "The captain's been asking questions about that smell, and I'm running out of ways to cover for your backwoods chemistry experiments." Jeb looked up from his work, his blue eyes holding an intelligence that most people missed entirely. Despite his thick Tennessee accent and deliberately rustic mannerisms, he possessed an analytical mind that had consistently scored in the top 5% on every military aptitude test. His deliberate cultivation of the hillbilly stereotype served multiple purposes. It made enemies underestimate him, prevented unwanted attention from superior officers, and allowed him to work on projects that might otherwise be questioned or confiscated. "Just brewing up a little something that might come in handy, Sergeant," Jeb replied, carefully sealing another jar and setting it aside to cool. "My granddaddy always said that when you're facing something bigger and stronger than yourself, you got to get creative with your tools." Rodriguez picked up one of the sealed jars, noting its unusual consistency and the way it seemed to shimmer with an oily iridescence. The compound was thicker than any moonshine he had ever seen, almost gelatinous in its consistency, and it gave off a faint chemical odor that made his nose tingle. "This doesn't look like any corn liquor I've ever come across," Rodriguez observed, What exactly are you planning to do with this stuff? Before Jeb could respond, the distant rumble of tracked vehicles began echoing through the forest. Both men immediately dropped into combat positions, Rodriguez reaching for his radio, while Jeb quickly began dismantling his distillery apparatus. Through the trees, they could see dust clouds rising from the main road that ran parallel to their position. Dust clouds that indicated the movement of heavy vehicles in significant numbers. The radio crackled to life in Rodriguez's hands as reports began flowing in from forward observers positioned throughout the sector. German armored units were moving through the valley in what appeared to be a major repositioning effort, possibly preparing for a counter-offensive against the recently established American positions. Early estimates suggested at least 24 armored vehicles, including several of the massive Tiger tanks that had proven nearly invulnerable to conventional anti-tank weapons. Captain Sullivan's voice came through the radio with characteristic Boston precision. All units, maintain observation positions and report enemy movements. Do not engage unless directly threatened. We do not have sufficient anti-tank capabilities to challenge this force directly. Jeb listened to the radio traffic while continuing to pack his equipment, but his mind was already working through tactical possibilities. The road below represented the primary German supply route through this sector, and if his calculations were correct, the convoy would be forced to slow down significantly when navigating a series of switchbacks approximately 800 yards from their current position. More importantly, the topography created a natural bottleneck where vehicles would be forced to travel in single file, making them vulnerable to attacks from the elevated forest positions. "Sergeant," Jeb said quietly, "I reckon I might be able to help with this situation." Rodriguez looked at the young private with skepticism. Despite his growing respect for Hawkins' unconventional thinking, the idea that a hillbilly with some homemade chemicals could significantly impact an armored column seemed wildly optimistic. The German tanks moving through the valley represented some of the most advanced military technology in the world, crewed by veterans with years of combat experience and protected by armor that could deflect even the most powerful American anti-tank rounds. "Hawkins, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but this isn't exactly a problem that's going to be solved with mountain ingenuity," Rodriguez explained patiently. "Those are Panzer Mark IVs and Tigers down there. Each one of those machines weighs 45 tons and carries enough firepower to level this entire forest. Whatever you've got in those jars, it's not going to make a dent in that kind of steel." Jeb nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suggested he was already several steps ahead in his planning. He had spent considerable time studying German armored tactics and had identified several critical vulnerabilities that conventional weapons failed to exploit effectively. Tank crews relied heavily on their vision ports and periscopes for situational awareness, and the ventilation systems necessary for engine operation created potential entry points for chemical agents. Most importantly, the rubber road wheels and drive sprockets that allowed these massive machines to move were far more vulnerable than the heavily armored hull and turret. "You're absolutely right about the armor, Sergeant," Jeb agreed. "But here's the thing about tanks. They're not just rolling fortresses. They're complex mechanical systems with all sorts of dependencies and weak points. My granddaddy used to say that the biggest tree in the forest will still fall if you know where to apply the right kind of pressure." The sound of the approaching convoy grew steadily louder as the lead vehicles began navigating the switchbacks below. Through binoculars, Rodriguez could see the distinctive angular silhouettes of German armor moving through the dappled forest shadows. The lead vehicle appeared to be a Panzer Mark IV, followed by what looked like 2 Tiger tanks and several half-tracks carrying infantry support. The entire column stretched back beyond the visible horizon, suggesting a force large enough to overwhelm any American positions in the immediate area. Jeb had retrieved a detailed topographical map from his pack and was studying the terrain with the focused intensity of an engineer examining blueprints. His finger traced the route the German column would be forced to take, identifying choke points and calculating angles of approach. The switchback section would indeed force the vehicles to reduce speed and travel in single file. But more importantly, the steep embankment on the uphill side created an elevated position that would allow projectiles to impact the more lightly armored top surfaces of the tanks. "Sergeant, What if I told you that my granddaddy's recipe could stick to metal like glue and burn hot enough to melt through steel plate? Jeb asked, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that made Rodriguez pause. And what if I said it could be delivered using nothing more than empty wine bottles and some strips of cloth? Rodriguez studied the young private's face, looking for signs of the typical mountain bluster he had come to expect. Instead, he saw the calculating expression of someone who had clearly thought through every aspect of what he was proposing. The sergeant had served long enough to recognize the difference between reckless bravado and careful planning, and something in Hawkins' demeanor suggested the latter. The radio crackled again as forward observers continued reporting on the German column's progress. The enemy force was even larger than initially estimated. Intelligence now suggested over 30 armored vehicles, supported by mechanized infantry and self-propelled artillery. Against this kind of opposition, the American forces in the sector could do little more than observe and report, hoping that air support or tank destroyers could be diverted from other operations to deal with the threat. Jeb began moving through the forest with surprising stealth for someone who cultivated such a rustic image. His movements displayed the fluid economy of motion that came from a lifetime of navigating difficult terrain, and he seemed to instinctively understand how to use natural cover to remain invisible from the road below. Rodriguez followed, increasingly curious about what the young engineer had in mind. The position Jeb selected was a rocky outcropping that provided both excellent concealment and a commanding view of the switchback section. More importantly, the elevation and angle would allow gravity to assist in the delivery of any projectiles while making it extremely difficult for the tank crews to return accurate fire. The German vehicles would be focused on navigating the difficult terrain and would have limited ability to elevate their weapons to engage targets on the steep hillside above. "This is where we set up," Jeb explained, already beginning to arrange his equipment. "The lead tank should be coming through that section in about 15 minutes, and they'll be moving slow enough for accurate targeting. The trick is going to be timing the throws so that the bottles impact just as each vehicle reaches the tightest part of the turn." Rodriguez watched in fascination as Jeb began preparing his improvised weapons. The mountain boy had somehow acquired a collection of empty wine bottles, presumably salvaged from abandoned German positions, and was methodically filling each one with his homemade compound. The thick, viscous liquid poured slowly, creating an almost hypnotic pattern as it settled into the glass containers. Each bottle was then sealed with a cork and fitted with a cloth fuse that had been soaked in what appeared to be a different chemical mixture. "The fuse will give us about 6 seconds after ignition," Jeb explained as he worked. "That's enough time to throw accurately, but not enough for the crew to take evasive action once they see what's coming. The compound itself will stick to whatever it hits and continue burning for approximately 3 to 4 minutes at temperatures that will compromise any armor steel used in current German tank production." The first German vehicle appeared at the base of the switchback section, exactly on schedule. Through binoculars, Rodriguez could see that it was indeed a Panzer Mark IV, its gray-green camouflage scheme making it blend naturally with the forest environment. The tank's commander was visible in the open turret hatch, apparently directing the driver through hand signals as they navigated the challenging terrain. Jeb had selected his first bottle and was holding it with the casual familiarity of someone who had thrown countless similar objects during his mountain childhood. The glass container looked almost delicate in his weathered hands, but Rodriguez had no doubt about the deadly potential of its contents. The sergeant found himself holding his breath as he watched the tank slowly approach the optimal engagement point. "Remember, this is for educational and historical purposes," Jeb said quietly, his voice carrying an unexpected note of solemnity. "What we're about to witness changed how American forces approached armored warfare for the rest of the conflict." The Panzer Mark IV reached the tightest section of the switchback, its speed reduced to barely 5 miles per hour as the driver carefully maneuvered around the sharp curve. The tank's engine note changed as the transmission shifted to accommodate the steep grade, creating additional noise that would help mask any sounds from the hillside above. Jeb lit the fuse on his first bottle and immediately began his throwing motion. The improvised weapon arced through the forest air with surprising accuracy, following a trajectory that would bring it down directly onto the tank's rear deck, where the engine compartment vents provided access to the vehicle's most vulnerable systems. The timing was perfect. The bottle struck the tank just as the fuse reached its chemical payload. What happened next exceeded even Jeb's calculations. The homemade napalm compound ignited with a brilliant white flame that immediately spread across the entire rear section of the tank. The chemical adhesive properties of the mixture caused it to stick tenaciously to every surface it contacted, and the intense heat began compromising the armor steel within seconds. More critically, the burning compound was drawn into the engine compartment ventilation system, where it began affecting the tank's mechanical systems. The German tank commander's initial reaction was confusion rather than alarm. Smoke and unusual flames around armored vehicles were not uncommon during military operations, and the crew's first assumption was that they had encountered some type of mechanical problem, or perhaps struck a concealed explosive device. It took several seconds for them to realize that they were under attack from an unknown weapon that was behaving unlike anything they had previously encountered. By the time the tank crew understood their situation, Jeb had already lit and thrown 2 more bottles. The second struck the vehicle's left track assembly, where the burning compound immediately began affecting the rubber road wheels and drive mechanisms. The third bottle impacted the turret ring, creating a cascade of flames that blocked the commander's vision and began infiltrating the fighting compartment through various openings. The Panzer Mark IV ground to a halt as its engine began showing signs of severe distress. Black smoke poured from the rear deck vents, indicating that the burning compound had successfully penetrated the engine compartment and was affecting critical systems. The track assembly on the left side was clearly compromised, with several road wheels already showing visible damage from the intense heat. Rodriguez watched in amazement as the crew began evacuating the disabled vehicle. The tank commander emerged first, followed by the gunner and loader, all moving with the urgency of men who recognized that their machine was no longer combat effective. The driver was the last to exit, and even from their elevated position, Rodriguez could see that he was having difficulty with the escape hatch due to heat and smoke in the crew compartment. "How in the world did you know that would work?" Rodriguez asked, his voice filled with genuine admiration. Jeb was already preparing his next set of bottles as the second German tank approached the engagement zone. This one appeared to be a Tiger, significantly larger and more heavily armored than the lead vehicle, but still vulnerable to the same tactical approach. "Engineering school teaches you about heat transfer and metallurgy," Jeb explained while working. "But growing up in the mountains teaches you about patience and precision. You combine those 2 things and you can solve problems that look impossible from the outside." The Tiger tank's crew had clearly observed what happened to their lead vehicle because they were approaching the switchback section with much greater caution. The tank commander was scanning the hillsides through binoculars, apparently searching for the source of the attack. However, the terrain and vegetation provided such effective concealment that even knowing roughly where to look, the German crew could not identify the specific threat location. Jeb adjusted his throwing technique to account for the Tiger's greater size and different armor configuration. His research into German tank design had revealed that the Tiger's massive weight made it particularly dependent on its complex transmission and drive systems, and any significant mechanical failure would leave the vehicle completely immobilized. The rear deck ventilation arrangements were slightly different from the Mark IV, but still provided access points for his chemical compound. The second attack was even more successful than the first. Jeb's initial bottle struck the Tiger's transmission deck with perfect accuracy, and the burning compound immediately began working its way into the vehicle's mechanical systems. The intense heat caused rapid expansion of metal components that had been manufactured to extremely tight tolerances, creating cascading mechanical failures throughout the drivetrain. 2 more bottles followed in rapid succession, one targeting the left track assembly and another impacting the turret bustle, where it would affect the gun's hydraulic systems. The Tiger's crew found themselves dealing with multiple simultaneous emergencies as their sophisticated tank began failing in ways that their training had never addressed. The third German vehicle in the column was another Panzer Mark IV, but its crew had clearly learned from observing the fate of their predecessors. Instead of proceeding through the switchback, they began backing away from the engagement zone while their commander attempted to establish radio contact with higher headquarters. Unfortunately for them, their retreat brought them into an even more vulnerable position, where Jeb could engage them from a different angle with gravity, providing even greater assistance. Rodriguez found himself serving as an ammunition passer, handing Jeb freshly prepared bottles as the young engineer systematically disabled one German tank after another. The process had developed into an almost rhythmic routine: light the fuse, calculate the trajectory, deliver the weapon with mountain-bred accuracy, and immediately prepare for the next target. "This is incredible," Rodriguez muttered as he watched the fourth tank grinding to a halt with flames consuming its engine deck. "You're single-handedly stopping an entire armored column with nothing but moonshine bottles and mountain know-how." The German infantry accompanying the tank column had begun dismounting from their half-tracks and spreading out through the forest, apparently attempting to locate and eliminate the source of the devastating attacks on their armor. However, their search efforts were hampered by the difficult terrain and the fact that Jeb's position was naturally camouflaged and positioned to provide multiple escape routes. More importantly, the infantry lacked effective weapons for engaging targets at the ranges involved. Their small arms were designed for close-range combat, and they had no way to accurately deliver return fire against an enemy who was attacking from elevated positions several hundred yards away. Jeb continued his methodical destruction of the German column, adapting his techniques as he gained experience with different tank models and crew reactions. Some vehicles attempted to accelerate through the engagement zone, but the difficult terrain prevented them from building enough speed to avoid accurate targeting. Others tried to provide mutual fire support, but their weapons could not elevate sufficiently to engage targets on the steep hillside. By the time ammunition shortages forced a temporary pause in the engagement, Jeb had successfully disabled 11 German tanks and several support vehicles. The once proud armored column was now a collection of burning, immobilized machines scattered along the forest road. German infantry continued searching for their tormentor, but the combination of terrain, concealment, and Jeb's intimate knowledge of mountain warfare made their efforts futile. "We need to relocate before they bring up artillery or call in air support," Jeb advised as he packed his remaining equipment. "This position's been too successful. They're going to start taking it seriously real soon." Rodriguez was already coordinating with Captain Sullivan via radio, reporting the unprecedented success of Hawkins' improvised anti-tank operations. The initial response from higher headquarters was disbelief, followed by urgent requests for detailed information about the weapons and tactics involved. The two soldiers moved through the forest with practiced stealth, relocating to a secondary position that Jeb had scouted earlier in the week. The new location provided similar tactical advantages while being far enough from the original engagement zone to avoid German counterattacks. More importantly, it offered access to a different section of road, where the remaining German vehicles would be forced to navigate another challenging terrain feature. The German column had ground to a complete halt, while officers attempted to assess the situation and develop countermeasures. Radio traffic intercepted by American intelligence indicated considerable confusion about the nature of the weapons being employed and the size of the force conducting the attacks. Several German reports suggested they were facing a new type of American anti-tank rocket or possibly air-delivered incendiary bombs. "They have no idea what hit them," Rodriguez observed with satisfaction. "As far as they know, they've run into some kind of secret weapon that they've never seen before." Jeb was setting up his equipment at the new position, taking advantage of the temporary lull to prepare additional bottles and refine his techniques based on lessons learned from the initial engagement. His supply of chemical compound was running low, but he estimated having enough material for perhaps 8 to 10 more attacks. "The beauty of this approach is its simplicity," Jeb explained as he worked. "They're expecting sophisticated military technology, so they're looking for radar signatures and launch systems and all sorts of complicated equipment. They'll never figure out that they're being attacked by a hillbilly with some mason jars and his granddaddy's chemistry knowledge." The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows through the forest when the German column finally resumed movement. The remaining vehicles had reorganized into a more defensive formation, with infantry scouts moving ahead of the tanks and additional space between vehicles to prevent cascading damage from further attacks. However, the tactical constraints of the terrain still forced them to navigate the same choke points that had proven so deadly earlier in the day. Jeb's second engagement was even more devastating than the first. Operating from a different angle and benefiting from accumulated experience, he systematically disabled the remaining German armor with clinical precision. Each attack was carefully calculated to achieve maximum effect, targeting specific vulnerabilities in different tank models and adapting to crew reactions and countermeasures. The Tiger tanks proved somewhat more challenging due to their heavier armor and more sophisticated fire suppression systems, but Jeb's compound burned too hot and stuck too tenaciously to be defeated by conventional firefighting methods. Once his chemical mixture penetrated the engine compartments or track assemblies, mechanical failure was virtually inevitable, regardless of crew skill or vehicle sophistication. By late afternoon, the entire German armored column had been rendered combat ineffective. 23 tanks and numerous support vehicles sat abandoned along the forest road, their crews either captured or scattered through the woods. The planned German counteroffensive had been stopped dead by a single American soldier, using improvised weapons crafted from moonshine distillation techniques and chemical engineering knowledge. Captain Sullivan arrived at Jeb's position just as the young private was cleaning up the last of his equipment. The captain's expression displayed a mixture of amazement, confusion, and professional curiosity as he surveyed the destruction visible through the trees below. "Hawkins, I need to understand exactly what happened here today," Sullivan said, his Boston accent carrying an undertone of barely controlled excitement. "Intelligence is reporting that you single-handedly disabled an entire German armored brigade using some kind of homemade incendiary weapons. Is that assessment accurate?" Jeb nodded modestly, his demeanor unchanged despite the magnitude of his achievement. To him, the day's work represented nothing more than the practical application of knowledge and skills he had been developing since childhood. The fact that it had strategic implications seemed almost incidental to the technical challenge of solving an engineering problem with available materials. "Yes, sir, that's about right," Jeb replied in his characteristic mountain drawl. "Turns out that if you understand the chemistry and physics involved, you can make tank armor work against itself. Heat expansion, metallurgy, mechanical tolerances, all that book learning from engineering school, combined with some practical knowledge about distillation and chemical synthesis." Sullivan requested a detailed briefing on the weapons and techniques involved, information that would quickly make its way up the chain of command to the highest levels of American military leadership. Within days, chemical specialists would be dispatched to analyze Jeb's compound, and his improvised anti-tank tactics would be studied and refined for broader application across the European theater. The immediate tactical impact was equally significant. The destruction of the German armored column had eliminated a major threat to American positions in the sector and prevented a counter-offensive that could have compromised recent territorial gains. More importantly, it demonstrated that individual initiative and unconventional thinking could achieve strategic results even when conventional military resources were insufficient. Rodriguez found himself looking at Private Hawkins with entirely new respect. The young man he had dismissed as a harmless mountain eccentric had proven to be one of the most effective soldiers he had ever served with. More than that, Jeb had accomplished something that seasoned tank crews and specialized anti-tank units had found impossible, stopping German armor using nothing but intelligence, creativity, and absolute mastery of his specialized knowledge. "I reckon I should probably cook up another batch of this stuff," Jeb said as he surveyed his depleted supplies. "Word's going to get around about what happened here today, and I suspect there's going to be considerable interest in expanding the program." The news of Hawkins' success spread rapidly through American forces in the region, generating requests for similar operations and tactical consultations. Within a week, Jeb found himself temporarily detached from his regular unit and assigned to a special operations group tasked with developing and deploying unconventional anti-tank weapons based on his innovations. The transformation in how his fellow soldiers viewed him was remarkable. The hillbilly who had been ridiculed for his backwards ways was now recognized as a tactical genius whose unorthodox methods had achieved what conventional weapons could not. Officers who had previously dismissed him as an amusing curiosity were now seeking his advice on technical matters and operational planning. But perhaps the most significant change was in Jeb himself. The young engineer had discovered that his unique combination of academic training and practical mountain skills made him ideally suited for unconventional warfare. He began developing additional applications for his chemical expertise, creating specialized compounds for different tactical situations and training other soldiers in improvised weapons techniques. The psychological impact on German forces was equally important. Intelligence reports indicated considerable concern about American development of new anti-tank weapons, with some units requesting additional air cover and artillery support when operating in areas where similar attacks might occur. The uncertainty created by Jeb's unconventional approach was proving as valuable as the physical destruction of equipment. As autumn progressed toward winter, Jeb's innovations continued evolving and expanding. His basic napalm formula was refined and improved, while new applications were developed for different tactical scenarios. The Moonshine distillation techniques that had initially served as camouflage became the foundation for a comprehensive chemical warfare capability that would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The young man from the Tennessee mountains had proven that sometimes the most effective solutions come from the most unexpected sources, and that academic knowledge combined with practical wisdom can overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. His story became legend within the American forces, inspiring other soldiers to think creatively about their own unique skills and backgrounds. Years later, military historians would identify the engagement in the French forest as a turning point in anti-tank warfare, the moment when improvised chemical weapons demonstrated their potential for leveling the playing field between infantry and armor. But for the German tank crews who experienced it firsthand, it would always be remembered as the day their technological superiority was defeated by a hillbilly with mason jars and his grandfather's moonshine recipe. The broader implications extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Jeb's success demonstrated that modern warfare could still be influenced by individual initiative and unconventional thinking, providing hope for smaller forces facing overwhelming technological odds. His story became a testament to the power of combining traditional knowledge with modern education, showing how seemingly obsolete skills could find new relevance in changing circumstances. By the time the conflict ended, Jeb had trained hundreds of American soldiers in improvised chemical weapons techniques, and his innovations had been adopted by special operations units throughout the European theater. The shy mountain boy, who had been mocked for his backward ways, had become one of the most influential tactical innovators of the entire conflict. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.